All right, so we're going to go over some vocabulary, okay, to do with genetics so that we understand kind of some of the terms that will be used, and then understand how traits are passed on, inherited, and expressed. Right? So Mendel was an interesting guy. He was actually a monk, okay, and his job, one of his jobs at the monastery he lived at, was to tend the garden where they grew their own food. Right? One of their main food sources were beans and peas. Beans and peas readily show very easy, traceable genetic traits. All right, in the shape of their pods, in the shape of the peas and beans themselves, in the color and shape of the flowers and leaves and all of this kind of stuff. They have very easily identifiable traits, and then you can also ensure that one plant breeds with another plant. Plants breed, by the way, if you weren't aware of that. Okay, when they pollinate, so when pollen goes from one flower to another, right, you get essentially that's the passing of gametes. Inside every pollen grain is a single plant sperm. Okay, that's what pollen is. When you sniff a flower, you can think about that pleasant thought now. Okay, so there's plant sperm in there, and in the bottom of the flower is the ovary. Okay, so at the base of the flower is the ovary. So when the pollen lands on the flower, okay, the pollen grain causes a reaction that essentially makes what's called a pollen tube down through the stigma and the style. That's the central part of the flower. Okay, and then the pollen, the sperm that was in the pollen will meet the egg that's in the ovary. Okay, and that will produce seeds, plural or single seed, okay, depending on the type of plant we're looking at, and then that becomes the fruit surrounds it after that. All right, so same for beans and peas because they're flowering plants and those are fruits. Okay, peas and beans are fruits. Okay, so Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk who used his observations of garden peas in particular to formulate ideas about what he called heritable characters, which we call genes, are passed from one generation to another. Right? So Mendel studied the structure of the garden pea because it was easy. Okay, there were 4 different ways that the pea could look. He could have round or wrinkled, yellow or green. Okay, and their flowers were either purple or white, and their pods were either inflated or pinched. Okay, which means you could actually see that, like, they would pinch around the peas inside. Okay, you could have green or yellow unripe pods. Okay, you could have axial or terminal flowers. Axial flowers means flowers grow from all over the plant. Terminal flowers mean they only grew at the top. Okay, these were all genetically inheritable characteristics, including long or short stems. Basically, this is normal and dwarf. Okay, is what they would call them. Okay, forms of the plant. Right, so these were easy things for him to identify in the garden, and they were clearly heritable, okay, from one generation to the next. Now, in order to make sure he was running a controlled experiment, he couldn't just let the plants pollinate willy-nilly, okay? He couldn't let them have their pollen go wherever they wanted it to go. So painstakingly, when the flowers appeared, he would go out with paintbrushes, okay? And he would touch one flower, and then he would bring the pollen on the paintbrush over to another plant and pollinate it. Okay? Normally that's done by either wind or insects, but what he was doing was ensuring that the purple flowered plant with the round peas and the pinched pods was fertilizing the plant with the yellow pods and the whatever, the white flowers and whatever. He was ensuring that he was crossing the plants he wanted to cross to see what things were dominant and what things were recessive. How many people know what I mean when I say dominant and recessive? Okay. Okay, so parents of a cross are often referred to as the P generation, the parents. Okay, and their offspring are referred to as F1 or filial generation 1, so the offspring. Okay, and then the next generation, so if you cross those ones, you get the F2, the second filial generation. Okay, and so on. So these would be, if he had a purple flowered plant and a white flowered plant, okay, and he crossed them, the entire first generation of plants had purple flowers. Right? What does that tell him about flower color? Purple's dominant. Okay, that's what it tells him. Right? The second generation, he would get a ratio always of 3-to-1 purple to white. Okay, which would confirm, of course, then that purple is dominant and white is recessive. Okay, but somewhere in there, there were a couple of recessive genes that got together and expressed as a white flower. Okay. Everybody all right with that? Okay, so an organism always has what we call a pair of alleles. Okay, alleles are forms of a gene. Okay, so there's a gene for flower color. The alleles of that gene are white and purple. Everybody follow? Okay, so a gene is something that codes for something. The alleles are the different versions of the gene. Okay, so what he figured was that purple flowered plants, okay, if they bred true, they were always purple. Like if he bred these two purple plants, he never got any white ones. Okay, he knew that they were dominant purple. Okay, he knew that the white flowers, if he bred white flowers, he only got white flowers. But as soon as he bred a white flower with a purple flower, he got purple flowers. Okay, so he knew that they were recessive. That's little p, okay, for the white gene. So when he crosses those, the reason every single flower in the next generation is purple is because they would all have one copy from mom, the big P, okay, and one from dad. Well, mom could only give dominant P, okay, dad could only give recessive. And so every single offspring in the next generation was big P, big P is dominant, so they were all purple. Okay, is that making sense to everybody so far? All right, now, if I breed these flowers together, I've got some recessive genes in there. Okay, what I end up with is when I cross them, I'm going to get 1/4 of them will have big P. Okay, half of them will have big P, and 1/4 of them will have little p. Okay, everybody follow me there. Okay, the reason for that is we draw what's called a Punnett square. Okay, so I basically break it down into the genes. So each one could give a capital P or a little p, So when capital P meets capital P, that's what I get. Okay, when I get capital P and little p, I still get purple flowers, and when I get 2 little p's, I get white flowers. All right, so I get 3-to-1 after that. Okay. All right, so that's what Mendel found out. This holds true for basically any gene that only has 2 alleles. Right? It gets more complex when we start dealing with things like blood type. Okay, because in blood type, there's more than 2 alleles. Okay, there's A, there's B, and there's O. Okay, and then there's the different combinations of all of those alleles. Okay, because there's partial dominance, okay, things like that. That's the same thing with eye color. Okay, eye color, there's more than 2 alleles, and there's partial dominance and total dominance on certain colors. Okay, what's the most dominant eye color? Brown. Okay, brown's the most dominant eye color. That's why it's also the most common eye color. Okay, the other alleles, okay, like especially for like blue eyes, okay, that's very recessive. You would have to have essentially 2 copies of blue in order to have blue eyes. Right? That's why it's rare. Okay, so terminology here, okay, if you have 2 copies of the same allele, you are a homozygote because you only have one version of the allele. Okay, if you have like big P, little p, then you are a heterozygote. Okay, you have both copies, right? Okay, so because of dominance and recessiveness, its appearance is due to its what we call genotype. So there's genotype. Okay, genotypes would be this. Okay, what combination of genes does it have? Phenotype is this. Okay, phenotype is what you show. I can't see your genes. I can only see what your genes make happen. Okay, what your genes make happen is the phenotype. What your genes are is the genotype. Okay, now, if we're looking at a chromosome, somewhere on that chromosome is a gene. Okay, there's a whole bunch of genes on any given chromosome. Okay, they have a specific location. Okay, that's something we've discovered from the Human Genome Project. Okay, is that we know that on our 23 chromosomes, okay, that on each one of them is a spot that codes for something. Right, and so what we learn from that is that sometimes is where crossing over can occur, okay? But for here, okay, this is where the allele for purple flowers is, okay? This is where the allele for white flowers is, but you can see it's the same chromosome and it's the same gene, so it's in the same place. Okay, okay, how do we get those genes? Well, it's the order of the base pairs in that section of the DNA. Okay, so you could have like, that's it, A and T go together. Right? It's been so long. Okay, so I'd have AT, CG, AT, and that would be purple. Okay, but if I had AT, TA, CG, or GC, then that would be white. Okay, so the order of the base pairs is what determines the gene. All right, so for each gene, an organism inherits 2 alleles, one from each parent, except for things that are X-linked. Okay, so you have 2 copies of every chromosome if you're female, because your sex chromosome is X. Okay, and so if you're female, you have XX. If you're male, you have XY. All right, which is why, okay, males show more often recessive sex-linked characteristics like color blindness. Okay, color blindness is on the X chromosome, and guys, we only have 1 copy of that. So if the gene for color blindness is on our X chromosome, we're colorblind because we only get 1 X. Okay, color blindness is incredibly rare in women because they have 2 copies of the X chromosome, and they're more likely to have the dominant gene for colored sight. Okay, whereas for guys, if we have the chromosome, or if we have the gene that says we're going to be colorblind, we're colorblind because we only have 1 shot at it. Okay, that sort of makes sense? It's something like it's like 10 times more common in men to be colorblind. Okay, it's ridiculous. Anyone in here know if they're colorblind? Okay, yeah. Okay. They do a test for it. Usually, most people don't find out until they're like taking their driver's test. Okay, and they make you look at the color blindness test thing, and you're like, I can't see anything in there. Okay, and if you're not colorblind, you can see different numbers or letters in the little palette. Okay, if you are colorblind, it all looks the same. Okay, Mr. Van Erf down the hall, he is totally colorblind. Okay, totally colorblind. We sometimes make fun of him and play tricks on him. So not really nice, but we do it. Okay. One day we all were wearing like the same pattern of shirt. Okay. Mine was like orange and blue, and somebody else's was red and blue, and his was like purple and something. I can't remember what. He comes in, hey guys, look, we're all wearing the same shirt. I'm like, yeah, Jerry, we're all wearing the same shirt. How did that happen? He's going around telling everybody about how we're all wearing the same shirt, and they're all looking at him going, what? You're wearing purple. It's not even close to their shirt, but he couldn't tell. Okay, that's why, guys. Stoplights are always oriented this way. Okay, they're either vertical with red always being on the top and green always being on the bottom, or they're oriented horizontally. Red is always on the left, green is always on the right. Okay, they have to be so that people who are colorblind know what color light is on. Okay, the top's always red, the left is always red. If it wasn't that way, okay, people who are colorblind would run lights. Okay, like Mr. Venner. Okay, he would be a menace on the road if it wasn't for that. They do?
Red is a square, circle is blue, the triangle is yellow, or circle's green, triangle is yellow.
Oh, well, that's a good idea too. Yeah. All right, so that's kind of one of the applications of it there. Okay, so we talked about this dominance thing here, okay, and we talked about how the Punnett square works, okay. So there's 2 alleles for each character, and they separate when the gametes are formed. All right. So when eggs and sperm are formed, obviously they only have 1 copy of each chromosome, so thus they only have 1 copy of each gene. So if my father has type A blood, and my mom has type O blood, okay, then I'm going to be what? I might be O. I could be A, but I certainly can't be B. Okay, nor can I be AB, right? Because I don't have the genes for B. All right, so it would all depend on what my dad is. Okay, because if my dad is A, he could be AA, or he could be AO. All right, the only way we would know which he is by looking at me and my sister. All right, we know my mom is O. The only way you can be O is to be double O. O is recessive. Even though it's the most common blood type, it's the recessive. Okay, so we look at me, I come out type A, my sister comes out type O. Which one is my dad? He's AO. Okay? The only way my sister could be type O is if my dad can give O genes, okay, or O alleles of that gene. Okay? If my sister was type A, then we know my dad's AA. Okay? She's not. She's type O. Okay? That's how we know. Everybody follow me on that? The rarest blood type is type AB negative. Okay? Yeah. It is incredibly rare because you have to have a type A parent, a type B parent, and they both have to be Rh factor negative because negative is recessive. Okay, so yeah, type AB negative is the rarest type because you could have, if you had a parent who's type A, he could be AA or AO. If you have a mother who's type B, she could be BB or BO. Okay, okay, that's why it's hard to get AB negative blood. Okay, the combinations that could produce that are the rarest of the combinations, especially with the negative Rh factor. Okay, because being Rh positive is dominant to being Rh negative. All right. So if we're looking at kind of things on people, okay, one very easy characteristic is your hairline. Okay, you can't count mine because when it starts to recede, it just always looks like a widow's peak. But okay, when you're young and healthy, okay, you can have either a widow's peak or straight hairline. Okay, so if we're looking at this here, okay, we have that widow's peak is dominant. Okay, so if you have big W, you're going to have a widow's peak. If you have big W, you have a widow's peak. If you're little w, then you'll have straight. Okay, so if you have a straight hairline, no widow's peak, that's the rarer form. All right, so if we're looking at, this would be like grandparents. The top layer here would be the grandparents. And then think it's squares, male, and yeah, circles are female. Okay, so when they have kids, okay, they have 4 kids. Right, and they had one girl with a widow's peak, one boy with a widow's peak, and 2 boys with straight hairlines. Right? Now, again, is that the ratio it should have come out as? No, but Mother Nature's a mad scientist. It just so happened that, okay, yeah, if we looked at like 100 people, probably 75 of them would have widow's peaks and 25 of them would have straight hairlines. But it's a bigger sample size. This is a small sample size. Okay. So when we're looking at this one here, okay, for the other side of this family, okay, so this is the other side, the maternal side. Then we have, okay, the mom has the widow's peak. The dad has the widow's peak, but they had kids that were straight and then one that was widow's. So that meant that they both had to be heterozygous for the widow's peak gene. If they weren't, okay, if one of them was homozygous for the widow's peak gene, then they would have had all widow's peak kids. All right. So it gets like when you start looking at this in your own kids, that's when it gets really interesting. Okay, when you're like, okay, so he's got this, and my dad had that, and it's like little things like attached earlobes versus hanging earlobes. Okay, all those kinds of things can all be passed on. Okay, so here's the other one, attached versus hanging free earlobes. Okay, attached earlobes are recessive. Okay, so if your earlobe's attached directly to your jaw, okay, that's the recessive form. Okay, hanging or free earlobes are the dominant form. So we see it obviously quite a bit more often. All right, that's all we need to talk about there. Oh, it's perfect timing. Okay, so for next week, guys, remember your cell anatomy lab is due on the 24th. Okay, we'll be going over some more cell stuff. We got a couple more activities to do next week. Okay, so there'll be a bit of stuff coming here, and then we'll go into multicellular organisms late in the week next week.